Okay, if you're just joining us, a very warm welcome to our interview. Um, we're going to kick off in a minute, but if you're happy to put your camera on, I know some people will be traveling, so it's okay if you do want to keep your camera off, but we'd love to see you, and so would Mark and Katie. And if you could change put your name and your company, that would be fantastic. And we'll be doing Q&A later, so it will help us identify you. Okay, we're 3 minutes past, Katie, so I think I am going to hand over to you.
Wonderful.
To kick us off. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Hello, everybody, and welcome to WeQual Executive Session today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Katie Litchfield. I'm the founder of WeQual. Actually, today marked an anniversary for me today. 5 years ago, I arrived in New York and spoke to certain companies about launching the WeQual Awards in America. And since then, my goodness me, we have had over 307 WeQual finalists, 103 winners that have come through, 57 CEO executive interviewers, including Mark, and also now 36% now sit on the executive committee. I've spoken to many, many WeQual women over the years, and one of the big questions they always ask is, what do the CEOs think? What are their insights? So I am thrilled to introduce Mark Cutifani, a four-time CEO and chairman today. This is a chance to explore the insights from Mark, who's been at the helm of major industry mining companies since 2006, leading giants like Anglo and Vale. Mark, you bring a wealth of experience and a unique perspective on leadership. I'm really looking forward to uncovering what you look for in the C-suite and board hires. Mark, welcome.
Australia, very pleased to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
So let's kick off. So first question I want to know, as an experienced CEO and chair, could you explain your approach to hiring on board level roles, and which boards have you sat on and now sit on?
Firstly, I'll start with the last part first. I'm the chair of Vale Base Metals, which is a group that has been put together to take all of the base metals assets of Vale into a new entity. So we've had the Saudis buy in, American investors, and we're focused on energy transition. And so it's a bit of a transformation role. And in fact, I'm currently in an acting CEO role while we actually find a longer term CEO for the role. On the board of Total Energies, the energy company. We used to call it an oil and gas company, but 30% of our energy is now low carbon or in renewable. So it's a broader energy company and becoming more so each day. I'm also the senior non-executive director at Laing O'Rourke, the construction group that's based out of the UK, but also has offices in other parts of the world. And I'm an advisor and involved in Power of Nutrition. I'm the chair of the board of trustees of the Power of Nutrition Global Foundation, Australian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy, looking as an advisor on the International Committee, and a whole range of other things, more NGO type stuff.
Wow. And so what is your approach when you hire onto those board level roles?
So it depends on the nature of the role and who you're looking for. But in terms of broad approach, the first thing I look for in someone for those roles is someone that can think at the right level. And for those that understand stratified systems, that's level 5 probably, if this is for a large corporation, or someone that's worked running as a general manager or runs 4 or 5, in our case, in the mines, 4 or 5 mines at that level. That's what we call level 5 work. or has the ability to think at that level. So they may not have run a regional group, but as long as they can think at that level. So it's around conceptual thinking. So going from tangible things that are quite logical to more concepts and where we think the world's going, and thinking about how all these sort of moving parts interact. That's a really important piece, because as a board member, you've got to be able to digest all sorts of information and try and make some sense out of it in being able to debate in the board. And that's the first point. Second point is actually around demographics. Looking for diversity on the board, I think, is really important in terms of the quality of thinking and the different perspectives. So, person's background, and we're looking for diversity of thinking and perspectives. That's the second point, because a board is a team, it's a collegium. And so that diversity of thinking is really important. Domain knowledge helps, but not absolutely critical. But you do need one or two domain knowledge experts to be able to ground the conversation in the fundamentals of that industry. So that's important, but that's part of the mix. And then experience. The more experience you have, the better. But sometimes, if you're looking for a younger person's perspective, you're not always going to get experience. So are they able to bring whatever experience they have and extrapolate and add to the debate? And that goes to the capability question. So if they've got the capability, the answer is they probably can. And so they'd be certainly a candidate. But they'd be the 4 points: capability, the demographic, diversity, domain knowledge, an advantage, and to some degree experience, but not always required.
And what would you say are the essential qualities you're looking for when you're interviewing a candidate?
So I start with that capability question. Are they thinking at the right level? Can they digest the information that's provided and really form a view and turn that view into some practical guidance or comments that will help the executive? So that's the first point. So it goes back to that capability point. Are they inquisitive? It's one thing to be capable, but if you're not particularly interested, or you're not poking and digging at things that might not look right, or maybe they look really good, and you want to understand whether they're as good as they really are. So that inquisitive nature, I think, is really important. And questioning, not making judgments, but always questioning, which in of itself is a form of coaching for people. So inquisitive and the way they go about the questioning is really important. And then the third point, which is sort of comes to that questioning issue, is, are they collegial, or do they understand the role of the board is not accountable management? It's about asking the right questions. Have you considered these particular points? And also being collegial with the people around the table, because at the end of the day, you don't necessarily agree as a board member, and you get to debate the points. But the really important point is not necessarily the disagreements. Can you align with the board on a position going forward? And that ability to be collegial and accept or concede a point if it's not critical and there's a broader group that are suggesting maybe something slightly different. And the ability to align is important. But at the same time, if it's a really important point that you want to make, the ability to just stand and hold and make your points is important. But ultimately, it's a team and it's a collective accountability. So the ability to align with the team when it's not absolutely something you agree with is really important. So that ability to be collegial, and it's a really important and a really difficult piece to get your arms around in many cases.
So you're in the final stages, you've got your shortlist, all the candidates are very capable. What are your key factors do you look for now?
Will they be a unique contributor? Will they really bring something different to the table? I think that's really important, because what we don't want is, everybody thinking the same. That's the last thing you want on a board. Um, on the basis that they've got the capability, what we don't want is intellectual arrogance.
Mm.
We want someone that's open, willing to debate, doesn't lecture, and is in the conversation, not um, trying to lead or trying to bully the conversation. So
Mhm.
we don't want that intellectual arrogance that can kill so many conversations around a board table. It's really about the colour and the perspectives around the board table. We want someone that treats people with dignity and respect.
Mhm.
If there are so many boards that can be literally destroyed by someone's inability to be respectful to others around the table and give everyone room to contribute, I think that's important. And at the same time, the courage to stand up, because sometimes a point is so important. And then if an individual feels that that point's really important to them, um, that ability to stand up without it being a lecture or without it being,
Mhm.
again, in the category of bullying, their ability to explain why it's so important and why they're hanging on to that point is just as important as being collegial, because there are some matters that really are important. Now, and in my first CEO role, um, and people know this, but it was a really difficult role because the company was under a lot of financial stress. They had a hedge book that was massively out of the money. And we'd worked together as a team really well for a number of years. And then myself and the chairman disagreed on a really important point. And from my view, it really was an important point. And as I said at the time, I I can't accept the accountability if I know it's fundamentally wrong, because I was
Mhm.
the executive, so I was on the board, but I was the chief executive, and I disagreed with the chair, and in the end I resigned, but I did it through a process, and I went somewhere else and handled the transition in an appropriate way, but it was the right call, and history proved it was the right call. So it's a last resort. But at some stage, if as a director you don't believe you can in any way, shape, or form align with the decision, then the alternative is to step down, and that's a hard one. You don't go into the job thinking those sorts of issues, but at the same time, if you want a successful
Mhm.
board career, there may come a time where you have to make that decision, and one would hope it's a very small percentage, but it's when values and other things are tested that you have to sometimes make really tough calls. But I think that's a minority.
Mhm.
But at some point, you have to be willing to back your values or your judgment. But again, it's about collegium, making that together, aligning, making sure you're part of that, and you've had the opportunity to put your points, but you do ultimately have to stand on your values if that's what the call impacts.
As a reminder, can you just go through the how does the criteria differ when hiring for a non-executive director or board role to an executive role?
So the executive is the accountable leader for the organization. It's a meritocracy. The leader is expected to deliver results. They are accountable for everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that accountability has to be held and felt by the chief executive. That means they are accountable for the performance of everyone in the organization. You can't stand back and say, well, Katie didn't agree. She's a problem. It's not my fault. Yes, everything is your fault as the chief executive, whether you like it or not. I hired Katie. I trained Katie. I gave her the resources to do the work. Well, it's my job to make sure she's got the resources to do the work. Yes, she's got an accountability, but ultimately it's mine because I've made the selection and you're in the role. So that sense of personal ownership and accountability, absolutely key. In a board role, um, the primary purpose of the role is governance and input to the strategy that reflects the desires and the wants of the shareholders which then sets the framework for how the executive puts the strategy together and how they'll execute. And then the governance role is monitoring their performance against those recommendations. So they're very different roles. And so the chair and the board have an accountability to make sure they represent the shareholders' interests, that the executive is delivering on all the things they said they would, and making sure that the risks to that delivery are understood and being managed as well. And that goes back to culture, goes back to values, it goes back to how the company is presenting itself in the broader market, but it's a different type of accountability. It's a collective accountability. So, chief executive, individual accountability, they are judged on their delivery. The board has a collective accountability because, in the end, that's what I'm saying, being able to align with the board on a position, because you can only give one position to the executive, and that's a very different type of role. And they're not accountable for the delivery. If the chief executive doesn't deliver, then they're accountable to put in place a chief executive that they believe can do the work, but they mustn't get in the way of the executive in doing the role, because then they're taking on the accountability and they're confusing the roles. So it's that primary role of select the chief executive, governance in terms of delivering on the strategy, and making sure that the shareholders' interests are covered in those conversations.
A lot of our members want their board roles and a portfolio of board roles, ideally in the future. So I just want to touch back on interview experiences that you've had and insights you can share with us. Are there common mistakes you feel that candidates sometimes make? And if so, how can they avoid these?
It probably goes to interviews of all kinds. So it's not specifically a board conversation. I think it's the nature of presenting yourself in an interview situation, and how you set yourself up for that conversation depends on the role. But I think a common mistake is people not taking a question at face value and maybe thinking there's more in the question than there really is. My suggestion is always answer the question as it's presented. If you're not quite sure, ask, clarify a little bit, and then in explaining your answer, a bit of context. So you explain how you've interpreted the question to explain the answer. Make 3 points, might be 4, could be 2, but make the key points you want to make, and then emphasize a key point that you think is really important in terms of answering the question, and look for cues on whether you've answered the question, or if there's a question that comes, it could be a hint towards what they're maybe looking for, or a nuance in the question you might not have picked up. But don't panic, stay calm. Quite often the questions aren't phrased terribly well. So you need to make sure that you understand what they're looking for. You may have to help them clarify it. Go through your answer and then look for the body language that tells you that, yes, you've ticked that box in terms of answering the question, or is there a nuance you might have missed that you need to draw out a little bit to make sure you leave them with the answer that you want to leave them with, given the question. I think the other thing is keep the conversation open as well. Don't make it a 1, 2, 3, stop. Make your points, and they may want to take the conversation a bit further. So be open to a conversation. It is a conversation. It's not meant to be a military drill. It's about them getting to know you. So give them the opportunity to find out who you are and make it a conversation when you can. And so you leave it open for them to input if they'd like to hear a bit more from you at a particular point. Don't talk too much, and don't try to be perfect. Be you.
I mentioned about the Week Well Awards at the beginning, because every finalist has to have an interview with a global CEO, and then I meet with them, or Mark does, to have a feedback session about how it went. One thing that has been very common throughout are all of the winners. The feedback was very much they had a peer-to-peer conversation. They didn't feel like it was an interview. How important is it being authentic, being your true self? And can you tell when somebody isn't being their true self? And what advice do you have on this?
So firstly, one would hope that the interviewer provides an environment where it can be a conversation to help relax.
Mhm.
And if that opportunity, or if they've set that up for you, then use it and make it a conversation. And your point about um, being or th- be in the mindset of it's a conversation where peers, it's a conversation. I think generally is a good place to start. Um, you always need to be a little careful that you don't appear too casual, but not being casual, but being comfortable. So the difference between casual and comfortable in the conversation is an important distinction. So be engaged. It's just a conversation. Unfortunately, not all the interviewers behave as you'd like them to be. Some do think that they're above everything given they're interviewing. So if you get someone and in that situation, then you might have to be a little more formal in your approach and respectful, but don't let that go too far. Be who you are, be comfortable in the conversation, and generally that'll probably bring them back towards a sensible conversation with you. But again, it's always about reading the individuals and making a judgment on how you play that. But in my experience, those that appear comfortable and happy to have a conversation and operate as a peer generally do a little bit better than most.
We will be going to questions in about 5 minutes. Now, our mission is 50-50 gender equality at the top of the world's largest companies. So the next question is going to be about women. Is there anything that you notice that women tend to do in interviews that men don't, or vice versa? Just wondering.
So whenever you make these sorts of judgments, you get into trouble one way or the other. You say, oh, wait a minute, that's being biased. And one of the things that I thought was really useful when we went through our inclusion and diversity work was unintentional biases. And so I had to think about this, trying to make sure I wasn't biased. But look, there were three things that I thought um, were shading, and I wouldn't say too much. I wouldn't overplay it. One, I find women tend to listen better, um, and are probably more tuned for an interview, um, which means I also think they're better prepared, because it's a bit tougher in my experience for women, particularly in the mining industry or the industry I come from, where when I started, um, it was illegal to have a woman going underground and all sorts of crazy stuff. Mm. And so there were no women in the workplace. And when women did come in, it was I wouldn't use the word threatening, although in some cases it can be. It was difficult. So they'd work twice as hard to demonstrate, that they could do the job and beyond. So yeah, I think the world's changed a lot, but they tend to be better prepared. And again, sometimes try a bit too hard because of what they've had to come through. So I think generally the comment would be better prepared for the conversation than I think the average male. But again, the gap's closing is my observation as we see more balance. As the balance improves, so too does the sort of behaviours sort of come together as well. But I think it's still challenging. and you see that a little bit in the interviews. But those 3 points that I make aren't negatives, in my view. It's just a difference.
And from your
In
vast
fact,
experience,
if anything, one would argue they're positives.
absolutely. And from your vast experience, who benefits from increased gender diversity and equality, and why do you think?
Um, just about everybody, in my view. Firstly, shareholders. I think that diversity of thought I talked about on a board or in the executive means you're taking a broader view of opinions into account in formulating a strategy. And to be blunt, if I'm talking about gender diversity, ignoring 50% of the world's opinion on stuff doesn't appear to be too smart if you're looking at making a return in business. So shareholders, employees, I think the social dynamic,
Mhm.
the more the workplace mirrors the external social dynamic, I think the more people tend to behave more appropriately in the workplace. And I think that's a healthy thing, that's a positive thing. And it helps make it, I think, a more constructive and a better reflection of society. Again, if you think about the markets you're serving, I think the broader the diversity and gender plus other diversity elements, I think are really important to understand the market and where the trends are coming. So ethnic, religious, I think all of those diversity parameters, and having that reflected in the business helps you think about the markets you're serving and stakeholders, understanding stakeholders and their different perspectives.
Mhm.
Again, in the world that it's sustainable conversation around sustainability, understanding the expectations of all parts of society are really important. When I talk about strategy, I start, and in fact, I've just written a piece in the Vale, and I start with audiences, and I said there are our shareholders, employees. I'm very specific on local communities because in mining, that's the group you most impact in the social space. I talk about our business stakeholders, so customers, supply chain. I talk about our social stakeholders. It may be union or it may be other groups that interact us. And then I talk about NGOs who they're not, I don't call them stakeholders because they might not want you to be successful. I call them other interested parties that we need to have a relationship and manage in a respectful, appropriate way because at the end of the day, an NGO may have a really serious impact on your business. You have to engage, you have to understand their position, and you have to manage that position. So those nuances are really important, and having a diverse workplace in all of its dimensions, I think, helps prepare a company to engage with all of those groups in an appropriate way.
Wonderful. Right, we're going to open the floor to questions. Emma, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to kick off with Corolla, if you're happy to come off mute and just say also where you're from as well, what company. And if you're happy to ask your question directly to Mark, that would be fantastic.
Okay, no problem. I just wonder, can I be seen?
Yes.
Oh yeah, it looks like. Okay, thanks, Mark, for your insights and sharing your experience with us. I was silly enough or brave enough to add a question to the chat. When you were sharing your the criteria you're looking for when hiring for board members, you were mentioning, for example, people thinking at the right level. So, but how do you identify this? How do you find out if a person has this capability in an interview?
So, so I'll make one point on that. If you're looking for young people or a different perspective, then the capability hurdle might be a bit different. And I'll make that point. But what I'm looking for on a board, depending on the nature of the work, is their ability to think conceptually. And by that I mean, and I'll use our industry as an example, politics, um, ESG trends, complexity of mining, local social issues. How do people think about those issues in a holistic way? And what conclusions and points would they make about, given all these moving parts, these are the three issues I think are really important. And so I'm looking for how people see the world and what they make of the world and how they come to a conclusion on why or where they think the three most important issues are in dealing with those issues. And so, Carola, it's not a black and white. It is a science if you go through an assessment process, but even the science has a fairly broad error component. So between the sciences and input in understanding how people think, and then sitting and talking to people about practical issues and trying to understand how they conceptualize and come to a conclusion is how we ultimately make a judgment on where we think they're operating. Now, I won't go too clinical, but let me use an example, and it's one I've used before. When I sit with someone, I say, are you aware of how you maintain a piece of equipment? Yes. Okay. Let's say if it breaks, you fix it. Yes. What are the things you might do to prevent it breaking? And I asked them to think about their car. And I said, well, what I do is I take my car in for a service every 3 months and we change the oil and do all the appropriate things. Okay, that's good. So they've got a sense of preventative maintenance. And then we talk about integrated maintenance systems, and we keep going up the complexity chain until they sort of look at you and say, well, I'm not sure what you're talking about. Or so you try and see if you can help them understand at that level the concept that you're dealing with. And so you're looking to see at what point they're struggling to understand the points you're making. Does that? I'm not sure if I'm explaining as well as I could, but it could be too narrow. So I use a car or something like that. So it's something that people understand or probably had some experience with. Or I ask them to give me an example of something that might be appropriate. Does that make sense?
I think I'm getting your point, and it's also going back to that it's a conversation. It's not questions and answers, and there's really, and you see how people follow, how it evolves and develops. So yeah, thank you for answering.
Yeah. So they don't have to be a maintenance expert, but they know that, well, if you put the water in or you do the basics, or if they're not mechanical or it's around, if it's a sporting issue, training and all those sorts of things, there are analogies you can think about. But that's part of the preparation an interviewer has to go through in making sure that whatever example they might use, it's relevant, somebody can relate to it and take you up the curve.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have another question mark from Alyssa. Alyssa, are you happy to share your question, or do you want me to read it out?
Can you hear me? Sorry, I'm traveling, but my question is sustainability is a hot topic, and what are the challenges for bringing sort of climate and nature into the boardroom as a topic to be prioritized?
Yeah, it's a really so. This is a hot topic for me in particular. Firstly, the word sustainability. It's actually and this is how we think about it. So it's not meant to sound like a lecture, but it's how we've internalized it in Vale. In fact, I've just come out of some conversations around it. I said, firstly, sustainability is an economic concept. And if you're not sustainable, that means you're not going to make money for the long term. So if somebody tells me we can't afford sustainability, that immediately tells me they don't understand the business. Because sustainability is about having a sustainable business. So that means, for example, and the 7 pillars of sustainability that I talk to, you can't hurt people. If you think that hurting people is okay and you expect them to give you their best, forget it. You can't hurt people morally or even through the business issues. people will not give you the best if you don't care about them. So safety and health, number one. Two, environment. Spilling, creating messes everywhere, again, not a sustainable behaviour. It's not okay to create an environmental mess, and we've all got an obligation in terms of climate change to change what we can change, or we won't survive. Three, social performance. In our industry, if you don't have a good relationship with the local community, you can add 30% to your costs. So for me, social performance, those relationships are absolutely critical. We've got to do the right thing. Now, how far you take that to achieve that outcome is always where there will be a debate about, yes, that gets us to that sustainability stage, but we might want to go further because there's competitive advantage in there. Now, that's the judgment call. But in terms of sustainability, if you're not sustainable, if you're not delivering basic sustainability elements, you don't have a sustainable business. You can't afford not to be sustainable. The fourth piece, people. Do you have the people in the organisation that will continue to allow you to be competitive and have a business? So talent pool, the pipeline, turnover, making sure you've got a sustainable business with people. Fifth, in mining, it's having the resources and the reserves to build your production base so you've got a critical mass and you can keep producing for the long term. At Anglo American, we used to look to try and have at least 20 years resources in front of us so that we knew we had a future as a business, so that people could see that that was obviously a sustainability piece. The sixth element was competitive cost position. Being in the bottom half of the cost curve was really important because in the end, because of the volatility of prices in mining, you could be losing cash 50% of the time if you're above the bottom half, the midpoint on the cost curve. Depends on the commodity. So your competitive position is an issue of sustainability. And then finally, balance sheet. Do you have the ability to finance or adjust the business as required as the world changes? So my comment is sustainability is an economic concept. That's how it was originally framed. And those 7 pillars do a pretty good job for us in the mining industry. And I also talk to free cash flow is what a CEO is responsible for delivering, and return on capital employed are the big messages for the shareholders. But if you haven't got those 7 pillars covered, you don't have a sustainable business. People quite often get sustainability confused with ESG. And ESG needs a rework as well, but environment, social covers some of the, and governance covers some of the points. Governance is an important point to have, and we talk about boards, but they are my sustainability elements. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's how I think about it and how we're building our businesses around those concepts.
That's fantastic. Sorry, I was smiling at the chat. It's a lovely comment. He is a gem from Jean Harvey. Jean Harvey Johnson. So thank you, Jean. That was very powerful, Mark. Thank you. And we've captured all of that. So we'll get those 7 pillars down and share them with everyone. Right. I'm going to go to Maddie Howlett. Could you just say where you're from, Maddie, as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Mark.
Thank you.
Oh, lovely to meet you. Thank you so much. I'm Maddie. I am part of a business called By Miles over in London. We're part of the Direct Line group. I loved what you were saying around kind of bringing in kind of more diverse boards and kind of increasing the diversity of thought particularly. I was wondering how you then make sure that your boards are not just diverse but also inclusive. And have you ever had to challenge behavior of other people on the boards, or work with your boards in order to make sure that you've got an environment where you can really you can make people feel valued as they come in, even if they have those different backgrounds or diverse kind of views?
Yes to all the above. Yes, we've had a few challenges with individuals that one confuse the accountability side and says, if I don't absolutely agree with everything, I can't stay on the board. I said, well, your board life's going to be fairly short because we all probably disagree with some points. The question is, can you align? and even as an executive group, a lot of conversations around aligning on critical issues, and you won't always agree. But if you're part of a team, that's actually what teamwork is all about. Is we're all individuals. We have different views. We come from different backgrounds. We're going to differ on some points. But what are the really important points to make sure you can align on? Obviously, values and the big push, but it's about all those pieces. The second point around behaviours, treating people with dignity and respect. They're easy words to roll off the tongue, but what does that look like? And we talked about this in the board I'm on now as the chair, and I said that being respectful is respecting another person's opinion and not assuming they're wrong because they've got a different view to you. So going the extra mile to understand where they're coming from is, I think, really important, and really important in demonstrating that collegial behaviour as a board. Treating someone with dignity is to never attack someone on the basis of who they are or try to diminish the person. Again, and they're different concepts, but they're both key. And if that becomes the raison d'etre of the board, then I think you're in a good place to start with. And how you deal with and how you bring that diversity piece in. There's only so much diversity or different perspective you can probably build into a board. So that I always think there's an important piece of being aware of where you might be weak and bringing people with different views in to take the board through an issue we might not have considered. Or if you're working in another country that you don't have a lot of experience in, can you bring someone in that will give the board a different perspective? And I think that's the chair's role as well, is bringing people with different perspectives in and challenging the board in the way they're thinking about particular issues. And I think that's really important. And again, how do you know you're being inclusive? I think there's a really important thing you do on an annual basis with the board is the review of the board, and really looking for an outside-in view of what we do from those groups and if you make it a really important point, we want you to look at us from that perspective and give us what you think we're missing. And again, in asking guests to come in, their feedback on what they heard from the board is really important, because quite often they walk away saying, well, gee, that group's sort of like this or like that. And that feedback's often quite useful after the event. So how do you get those perspectives in the conversation in a constructive way? You've usually got to be outside in. One thing, my kids are no holds barred and telling me all the things I do wrong. You need people that are willing to give you honest and direct feedback, even if at times you might question it and it makes you feel uncomfortable. That's when you should be made feel uncomfortable, and that's probably when you learn the most.
Love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maddie. Wow, we've got quite a few more hands raised, Mark. So I'll go to, I think it was Sarah from S&P next.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mark, that's fascinating. Thank you for taking the time with us. You talked really intriguingly about values being tested. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, obviously there's a red line that is something illegal, or, we know that that's a sort of cause to resign and that's the right thing. But how long does it take, and how far do the values have to be tested before you really make that decision of saying, enough, can't do this anymore?
It's a really important question, and it's a tough one too. At what point does your stomach have a knot in it? Sometimes judgment is not about the facts, it's how do you feel? Yeah, and if there's a knot in your gut, and that's where I got to, and I won't say the company, but it was the knot in my gut, because we followed everything as we should on disclosures, and we did all the right things. But the conversation, I wasn't comfortable in the conversation. I said, look, yes, technically we've covered all the angles and everything else, but you know what? I still think we need to say more on this particular point, because if I'm a shareholder, I would feel as though there was something missing in the conversation. So your gut feel is something, as a manager, I think we learn over time, or in society more broadly. If it doesn't feel right, then don't ignore it, explore it, share it with others, and pull it apart and talk about it, and be in a conversation. And that's why I think it's really important for a board to be comfortable sharing stuff. So, look, I'm not quite sure how to articulate this, or this just doesn't feel right. But if it doesn't feel right in your gut, it's probably not right. And if you can express it, or it just helps share why you're uncomfortable, good boards will help you sort of pull that apart, and try and help you get comfortable, or adjust to that point where you're comfortable with what's being proposed. And sometimes there are some really difficult issues, and I'm going to use one that is really controversial, and I mean it to be, because then it gets really hard. If you look at what's happening in the Middle East, there's no there's never a black and white answer in those situations, and there's issues both ways. And again, I'm on dangerous territory, because for some it is very clear, and talking the issues through ultimately is the way to find the right pathway. And we're seeing a dialogue occur, and it probably will take a bit more time to find a solution, but they will find a solution, but it's going to take time. And sometimes these values issues are very similar. If you've come from a particular perspective and something's been done to you, then you'll have your own response, and vice versa. So how do you ultimately unpack all of that and try and land on something that works for both, is usually the toughest set of conversations you'll experience on the board, but probably in many ways the most important in bringing the board together as a group that shares a common set of values. I know it's not a black and white answer, but it never is, and it's not meant to be. It's meant to be, what's your judgment? What's your heart tell you?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to go straight to Charlotte from Sandvik, please.
Sorry, can I make one other point?
Yeah.
Sorry, one really
Of
important
course.
is if it's not right in your gut, how do you ask someone why, and they've got a different position, finding out why they're comfortable, that you might not be thinking on something that they might have a different perspective that they're processing differently to yourself, that may or may not help you understand where they're coming from, and vice versa. So it's just giving enough room for people to be able to explore how each other feels on a really difficult matter, and taking a little bit of time, and forget the agenda and the timetable, and giving those sort of matters the time they deserve, I think is really important. So sorry, I didn't want to shortchange that one, because that's such an important question.
Great. Thank you, Charlotte. Over to you.
Thank you, and thanks, Mark, for a very interesting session, and thank you for taking the time with us. I'm going back a little bit to also coming from the mining and construction industry, and given the fact that also looking at Sandvik, we come from very low level of female managers and low number of female board members. What do you believe, and how do you balance, the need for thorough industry specific knowledge with the benefit of having a diverse team, either on a board or in a management team?
So on a board, I think having at least two strong technical experts, and I mean technical, not necessarily nuts and bolts, but if it's HR or organisation, someone who understands organisation models, those sorts of things, someone who understands domain knowledge is important, to sometimes give the context for why things are or why they should be different. So I think that's important, but not as important as the executive, but I'll come back to that in a second. On the board, I think someone that's got depends on the nature of the industry, but an external perspective. Sustainability, I think, is a really important piece these days, energy transition. So I think the board has to more reflect the world at large and be able to take the world at large through the eyes of the domain experts and ask a different set of questions that the technical experts would only ask themselves. So if you've got, let's say, a couple of domain experts and someone really looking at the sustainability issues or the organisation issues or the geopolitics, and at the moment geopolitics is such a moving piece, their perspectives are really important. And then understanding from a technical point of view, how do you deal with those issues? Because in our industry, you've got to go where the resources are. You don't get to pick. It's about geology. It's not about geopolitics. You've got to start with the resources. And if that means you end up in a country where you've got really different perspectives, then having someone who knows that stuff is really helpful. So I think a board has to have some domain knowledge and strong domain knowledge in maybe one or two people, probably two, because they'll have different perspectives. Beyond that, I think it's much more important to have a collegium of different perspectives that can help navigate through some of these really difficult issues. And the chair's role is to try and navigate and land on an aligned position, taking all of those pieces into account. Now, in an executive, you generally hire based on domain knowledge in key accountable roles. Now, the more you can mix up diversity with those domain roles, the better. Now, I've made the point, and I think, Katie, I'm not sure if we were talking about it, and I said, when you're hiring for an executive, and let's say we want to, and we talked about hiring women, or because we started off at 11%. When I left, we were at about 30%. And I said, on domain knowledge, absolutely critical for appointment in safety or high-level technical expertise. There might be 2 or 3 roles on the executive that really are domain-specific, require very strong technical skills, that you're required to hire someone with the right experience and the skill, the domain knowledge and the experience. There's a whole range of other roles that are much broader. And in my view, you can then be, you can provide a broader range of candidates to fill those roles, because they don't need the domain knowledge. What they need is the capability. And with capability, they've got the ability to learn quickly. So that's one. And two, they don't necessarily have to have the experience. Again, if I think they can learn quickly, we'll take a bigger bet. But on the very specific domain knowledge points, a lot harder. What we always try and do is have, if I talk gender, at least 50% of the candidates for the role have to be women. So it makes us work harder getting the right candidates into the conversation. And that's where the hard work has to be. You have to try and get a much...
Sorry for interrupting, but the 50% in looking for candidates, are you able to actually hit that target? Having 50% on women for screening for candidates, or for specific roles?
I'd say 70 to 80% of the time we were able to do that. But again, it's hard work, but it's deliberate. You've got to do the research and make people look harder for the right candidates. But again, you can give them more latitude depending on the nature of the role. But again, that's changing in my view, because as more women become experienced, even the technical roles are easier to find these days. So you just got to make people work harder at the front end, in my view.
Thank you.
I would love to go to more questions, but we're a little tight on time. Katie, Mark, can we do one more?
Yes, let's do one more if we do it super quick. Go for it.
Oh, I don't know who was first. Virginie.
Privilege. I feel privileged to have the last question. Hi,
Oh.
Mark. Virginie, working 20 years at Holcim, so your message on the mining industry echoes to me. Look, our industries, construction, mining, have been through several changes, although very conservative industries, safety, climate, sustainability. How do you take with your board the new revolution with artificial intelligence? Are you planning to embark new people in the board, new executive? What would be the fastest and more efficient way to embark this new revolution? Thank you.
Yeah, look, I think it's so important. Artificial intelligence, I mean, we data neural networks. I remember the old conversations around data and how you use data, but it goes much further than anything I've seen. And in my previous role, we built quite a strong artificial intelligence team, and we built that at the centre. It's changed a little bit now. Probably going forward, people don't see that as important as I do. I think artificial intelligence is game changing because it's about data and about understanding the data and having different perspectives on the data that's available. And in fact, identifying new uses for the data, which is where it's even more powerful. So I looked at biomedical and how quickly they've come along in developing vaccines and other products. And if you look at in our industry, leaching technologies, and I've invested in some new leaching technologies, and they said, look, it's going to take us 3 years to get from here to here. And we said, well, why don't we learn from the biomedical groups how quickly they've come along? What could we do in terms of artificial intelligence and develop our thinking? And when I was at Anglo, we actually went to Schlumberger to find people that we really thought out of the box, and they were based in Houston, and they really were thinking differently about artificial intelligence, its application, and literally for everything they were doing, they could think of other ways of doing it or providing a framework for us to look at doing things very differently. So I think we're slow adapters in the mining industry, and we at Anglo we're trying to speed all of those processes up. And some of the things they did were remarkable, in the twinning of equipment. So a big difference. And if you want to really drive your costs down and do things differently, then I think artificial intelligence is an absolute must do. Getting the balance and applying it correctly is the key.
Mark, thank you so much. On behalf of everybody, we appreciate your time, wisdom, your insights, how your mind works. Before everybody goes, I'd be so grateful if you could just add here, how would you recommend WeQual Global to a colleague? Please do. That does really help us with our feedback. Our next session will be on the 15th of February. This is where the CEO of WeQual, expert coach, plus now a best-selling Amazon author, Mark Bateman, will be leading with authenticity. Mark, thank you very much. Thank you, members.
Thank you.
Fantastic session. Thank you
Pleasure.
so much.
And thank you for the great questions.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Mark.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.